Today we are joined by Chris. He will be doing a presentation for us, very special guest all the way down from Vancouver, BC, so he made it across the border safely. He's here to talk to us. Before we get started, I just want to thank a few people who made this event possible. So our sponsors for the event this evening are Lookaville General Contractors, WTA, Whatcom Council of Governments, and Citizens Transport Advisory Group. So I think a lot of those people are in the building. Maybe if you're a sponsor, you can raise your hand if you want to sponsor your organization. So thank you to these people. Also a big thank you to the Institute for Energy Studies, and the biggest thank you of all to Therese from Walk Bike Bellingham. Walk Bike Bus Bellingham. There we go, the third one. She made this event possible, got it all arranged for everyone, so big thank you for her. And now Christine Grant is going to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thanks, Stella. I am very pleased to be introducing Chris Bruntlett this afternoon. Chris is an architectural designer and the co-founder of Modacity, a creative agency that works to inspire happier, healthier, simpler forms of mobility. Together with his partner, he works with a variety of organizations to address the evolving needs of cities, large and small, and enable a variety of mobility options. In a few weeks, he and his family are moving from Vancouver, BC to the Netherlands, where he will start a new job with the Dutch Cycling Embassy. So in the summer of 2018, Chris and Melissa published a book called Building the Cycling City, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality. And I'm just going to give a little personal plug for the book. I bought a copy of their book right away and enjoyed it immensely. The book explores the incredible successes of the Dutch transportation system. And the book is obviously about cycling as a form of transportation, but it is also about land use, public transportation, making our cities safer for our kids, and even how cycling cities can actually be much easier places to drive than car cities. So it is a very technical book in some ways, but it's also really fun. And you kind of feel like you're traveling through the Netherlands with Chris and Melissa. So they draw a lot of connections to the ways that North American cities are learning from the Dutch. So I would highly recommend buying a copy of the book, and Chris is able to sign books tonight. So thank you to the Westward Bookstore also for being here tonight to help with that. So without any further ado, I want to say welcome to Chris, and let's give him a very warm Bellingham welcome.
I'm so glad we were managed to squeeze this in, Therese. Full credit to her. Melissa and I were on our book tour from September to December, traveling around the world, Australia, New Zealand, and she was persistently emailing us to make sure that we also visited Bellingham. Unfortunately, Melissa couldn't be here this evening, but pleased to make the journey. And as Christine said, you know, we've got 2 weeks left before we disappear to Europe, so we just squeezed it in before the finish line. So. Building the cycling city. Why do you have a Canadian standing here talking about the Netherlands? How the heck did that happen? Melissa and I, as some of you may know, sold our family car in 2012 and started getting around by foot, by bicycle, by public transport, which was really a product of the environment, the built environment that we lived in. Vancouver has great transportation options. So we didn't think much of it, but we started getting asked questions. How do you do that with children? How do you get the kids to school? How do you get groceries home? How do you bicycle in a skirt? Bizarre questions like that, and we were kind of tired of answering the same questions. So Melissa ended up starting a blog that she called Bello Family's Diaries, and started to try and answer some of those questions in the hopes that she wouldn't have to do it all in person. I myself was on my own journey into bicycle advocacy. Cycling to my work in an architect's office every day, and I was kind of tired of being the only one that was riding around in his work attire, in my work attire. Everybody else was kind of in brightly colored Gore-Tex and spandex and on drop handlebars, and they were racing to get where they were going as quickly as possible. And I was the weirdo kind of rolling around on my slow Dutch bike with a suit and tie and no helmet on. So I got together with a group of friends and we formed the Vancouver Cycle Chic Society, which kind of naively thought we could change the bike culture in Vancouver through the imagery that we presented. So we started photo blogging, we started writing articles. We produced a series of short films that were called the Vancouver Cycle Chic Films, all in the hopes that we could present this slower, simpler, more civilized bicycle culture in Vancouver, and people would latch onto it. So it took until only 4 years ago when Melissa and I kind of realized we were doing the same thing. We were off in our own worlds. She was blogging and I was working with my friends on Vancouver Cycle Chic, that we decided to join forces and create Modacity. And one of the first projects that we did was we decided to go to the Netherlands for 5 weeks in the summer of 2016. Take the children and live as the Dutch do, visit 5 different Dutch cities: Amsterdam, Eindhoven, Utrecht, Groningen, and Rotterdam. And the plan was just to write a series of short articles, 5 articles about the 5 cities, and that was to be the beginning and end of it. But we absolutely fell in love with the place. We were transformed by what we saw there, what we experienced there, the way they built their cities, that we never felt we got the true story out in those 5 articles. So we wrapped it all together in a book pitch to Island Press, and we were lucky enough that they worked with us to refine that, and the book was finally published in August of 2018. So let's get into it, but before we do, I want you to just take a second. You can close your eyes if you'd like, and just imagine your commute to work in the morning. How are you getting there? What are the sights? What are the sounds? What are the experiences? What are the emotions? And what are you feeling? And then open your eyes and you can see what it's like for the Dutch. Taste of what we experienced. That was specifically in Amsterdam, and you could stand there at a traffic light and watch light phase after light phase, dozens and dozens of cyclists pass through. And we like to point out that we didn't actually pay the gentleman to stand whistling behind us while he was making the film, but it proves the point that you can move thousands and thousands of people through an intersection with very little noise or disturbance to the people that live and work in the area. But it wasn't until we started digging into the numbers that we really gained an appreciation of what the Netherlands had accomplished as a nation. I think Copenhagen gets a lot of the press and the plaudits as the world cycling city. It's done very well as promoting itself to the world. A couple years ago, it announced proudly that there were more bicycles than cars in the city of Copenhagen for the first time in decades. And the Dutch are quietly sitting on the fact that there's actually over 202 different cities and towns in the Netherlands where bicycles outnumber cars. So they've accomplished what Copenhagen has in a variety of scales and a variety of contexts, from one corner of the country to the other. They're just being the kind of humble, understated people that they are. They're not known to celebrate themselves. They're not braggers. They're very kind of down-to-earth people. But we felt it was something definitely worth shining a light on, because there's no other country in the world that's accomplished this in terms of making its cities not just bikeable, but much more livable. But every time you write about the Netherlands, every time you tweet about the Netherlands, every time you post anything about the Netherlands, you get the same pushback. Our city's different. That would never work here. It's flat, it's hilly, it's whatever. The Netherlands is just in its own ecosystem, and their method of building cities is not transferable anywhere else. And so we kind of set down, trying to break down some of the myths that we heard, and then we do this in the introduction to the book. To try and dispel some of these myths, because I think there are very detrimental mental barriers to actually building cycling cities outside of the Netherlands. The first one you probably heard is it's flat. In the Netherlands, it's as flat as a pancake, and that's the one and only reason that the Dutch cycle. In response to that, we often point out that if it were that simple, then Winnipeg on your screen, there's Kansas City. Florida is actually the flattest state in the Union, I believe. Not very pleasant places to ride bicycles. So it's far more the way we design our cities, the way we design our streets, has a much bigger impact on cycling mode share than does the terrain of a city or a country. And then the next thing we always heard was the weather's different there. It's milder. It's they don't get the winters. They don't get the hot summers as we do here in North America. But obviously that's nonsense. Anyone that's been to the Netherlands experienced a winter storm off the North Sea. They get winds of up to 120 kilometers an hour blowing in off the ocean. Plenty of snow, plenty of wind. And they keep on pedaling. They'll get 35, 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. They keep on pedaling. The bottom line is they've been given a safe space to cycle, and they will use it as an extension of walking year-round, and don't let a little bit of bad weather get in their way. And then the third thing we always heard was that the Dutch are somehow more altruistic than the rest of the planet. They care more about egalitarianism, environmentalism, and the like. And again, that was around the time that the gentleman on your screen, Bert Wilders, was rising to prominence. For those of you who don't know, he's kind of the Dutch Donald Trump. He ultimately didn't win a majority in the national election there, but got enough of a vote to prove that their society is just as flawed as ours. They just happen to design their cities a little bit different. So the reality is that the Dutch cycled because they built a vast nationwide network. They have 35,000 kilometers of fully separated cycle tracks. That's equal to a quarter of their 140,000 kilometer road network. Excuse the metric. I can't do, we do the mileage conversions in the book, but I don't have them in front of me. And it's important to remember that this infrastructure, a great deal of it was built in the past 20 or 30 years. So this idea that the Netherlands rose up out of the sea with bike lanes already pre-built is absolute nonsense. They built a lot of it in our lifetime, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into building that infrastructure. They had a lot of fights and a lot of the same conversations we're having now, but they pushed through it and they see through the other side, and now they're reaping the benefits of those battles. But just as important as the physical separation between bicycles and cars is the fact that the Dutch have tamed the automobile in their cities. The stat that we use in the book is that 75% of urban streets in the Netherlands are traffic calmed with a speed of 30 kilometers an hour or less. So that's 20 miles per hour. And it creates these conditions where virtually every street in a city is a de facto bikeway, and not just the ones that are painted green on Google Maps or on a bike map. And then lastly is a matter of investment priorities. The latest estimates were that the Netherlands spends about 35 euros per year per person on cycling. That's almost $50 US. The rate varies from North American city to North American city, but we can say in Vancouver we're spending about $5 per person. So it's only about a tenth of what they're spending in the Netherlands. For the most part, that's going into just plain old red asphalt, separated cycle tracks, and traffic calming, but once in a while they get to build something pretty spectacular, such as the Hoven Ring that you can see on your screen. So to better understand the types of people cycling in the Netherlands, we like to point out that the Dutch language has two separate words for cyclists. The first on the left is wielrenner, which translates to wheeled runner. So that's kind of the hunched and helmeted cyclists that we're perhaps more familiar with in a North American context. They're riding for sport, for speed, for fitness, and exercise. They're riding a carbon fiber bike with drop handlebars and clip shoes, and they're trying to get from A to B as quickly as possible. But the vast majority of people you'll see on Dutch streets, we're talking 99.9%, are just the everyday fietser, which just translates to person on a bike. They're rolling around in whatever they happen to be wearing that day on an upright Dutch bike. No special clothing required, no head protection required, and they're treating cycling as an extension of walking, so just a slightly faster, slightly more efficient way of walking around their city. So rather than running with wheels, we liken it to walking with wheels. So let's get into the stories. I think every city presents itself, presents a unique lesson, a unique context, and we'll start with Amsterdam because I think it's a pretty powerful example of what citizen activism, citizen intervention can achieve and how it can alter the course of a city. For those of you who don't know, Amsterdam in the 70s was kind of the heart of some really radical protest movements. There were at its peak, the Stop the Kindermord movement, which was the Stop Child Murder movement, rose up in opposition to this post-war planning mentality that was starting to give cars priority in their cities. And a lot of the Dutch people stood up and said, no, this is not acceptable. There's too many children that are dying and being injured by the cars. We need to rebalance our streets for other modes of transportation. So there were mass riots every summer in Amsterdam. At their peak, they reached 15,000 people cycling through the streets of Amsterdam, demanding a different vision for their city, a more human and bike-friendly city. And they staged these mass die-ins where 3,000 people lay in the middle of Museum Plain in Amsterdam with their bicycles to represent the thousands of cyclists that were being killed by cars each and every year. And if you now visit Amsterdam today, it's a very different place than what those post-war planners initially envisaged. And the story we tell in the book, which is really powerful, is in Jodenbriestraat, which is the old Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. In those post-war plans in the 70s, was supposed to be razed to the ground for a at-grade motorway, 6 lanes of traffic that would completely destroy the neighborhood and then connect to other motorways that would crisscross Amsterdam. And it was in response to these plans that the citizens rose up. They organized themselves politically and they protested. And eventually these plans to build this motorway were canceled, but it was only by a single vote. So it was council voted 28 votes to 27 to cancel this motorway, which is quite astounding when you think that how razor thin the margins were and how hard Amsterdammers had to fight back in that period of time to enjoy the city and the streets that they enjoy today. And the Amsterdam that we see today could have looked very differently had that one single vote gone slightly differently. But we don't just want to focus on the Netherlands, so we need to look at parallels in North America, and that's what we try to do in the book, is find examples of North American cities that are embracing the spirit of Amsterdam. And for that, we didn't have to look very far in Boston. There, a friend of ours, Jonathan Fertig, Right Leg Pegged on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, was really pushing the Boston City Council to think differently about their streets and to demand more from his elected officials. Unfortunately, it was in response to some rather tragic events. A woman was hooked by a truck on Massachusetts Avenue in Boston, and Jonathan went out that night with some traffic cones with some flowers, and basically just set aside a protected bike lane just to kind of try to shame the city into action. And eventually it worked, I think, through his kind of cheeky tactical urbanism, which just was kind of really lo-fi paint and planter boxes. It eventually evolved into people-protected bike lanes. But it was all part of this movement to show that people on bicycles are vulnerable road users that deserve space of their own, and if the city council wasn't going to move to implement some of these protected bike lanes, then the people would push them in the right direction using their voices and their bodies. But sometimes it's not enough to wait for your elected officials to do the right thing. Sometimes you just have to run for office yourself, and that was the takeaway that we found when we started digging into Groningen in the north of the Netherlands, a smaller city of about 150,000. And there, a 24-year-old kid, basically, Max Vandenberg, he was fresh out of university, decided to run for city council in opposition to some of these post-war plans to start making his city more centered around the automobile. And he ultimately won, and 2 years later, at the age of 26, found himself the youngest deputy mayor in Groningen's history, and decided to use that position of influence to really make change in his city. He implemented a traffic circulation plan in 1976 that cut the city center into 4 quarters, and it made it impossible to drive from one quarter to the next. So essentially, drivers had to circumnavigate the city to get from one quarter to the other, which made driving kind of the least convenient method, and walking, cycling the most direct route and the most direct way to get around. And it was all implemented overnight. So one morning, Groningen residents woke up. You can see the bottom left corner there. The motorists lined up to get into the city, and they were met by hostesses with baskets of flowers and informational pamphlets, all explaining to them that the car was no longer king in Groningen. And it's important to stress that this was in the face of some really vehement opposition. The shopkeepers in the city centre painted slogans on their walls. They protested the city hall. Max was the subject of death threats. But in the face of that, he knew this was the better thing to do for his city, and the Groningen, again, that you will visit today if you ever go there, is a better place for it. 2/3 of all trips in the city centre are made by bicycle. The city's absolutely drowning in bikes, which is both a wonderful thing but also a tremendous challenge. So they have to really work on the bike parking situation. You can see in the bottom left there, bikes are just left everywhere, and so they had to set out these red carpets to allow for access to storefronts, so that they wouldn't clutter and block access to the shops. There's that many bikes parked on the streets. They're also dealing with a problem a lot of us would probably love to have, and that's bicycle congestion. So a lot of the routes that connect the city centre to the university, it's about a 20-minute bike ride to the university. They're so heavily trafficked by students that you get these traffic jams and these backups at specific intersections. So they've implemented smart routes and marketed them specifically to students as the most convenient way to get to the campus rather than taking the bus or a car. And they can travel directly to the university now without putting their foot down once, because the intersections have all been specifically designed to prioritize bicycle traffic all the way through to the university campus. On the subject of political bravery, again, coming back to a North American example, we lived and breathed for 10 years, and that's our hometown of Vancouver. So about 10 years ago, we elected a bike-friendly mayor, Gregor Robertson, who was kind of this young idealist, environmentalist, urbanist, in the same vein as Max Vandenberg. And he, basically the day after he was elected, set about building out a network of protected bike lanes in the city centre. He started with the Burrard Bridge, which is a 6-lane bridge that crosses Falls Creek into the city centre, reallocating 1 lane of traffic for protected bike lanes. And in response to that, the city lost its collective minds, and there was a tremendous amount of outrage. The press predicted it was going to be the beginning and end of Mayor Robertson's career. The downtown businesses claimed it was going to choke the lifeblood out of the city. As you can imagine, there was a lot of angry column inches written, but to his credit, Mayor Robertson stuck to his guns, saw those changes through, and started building out basically a protected bike lane a year over that 10-year period, to the point where we now have a rather robust network of infrastructure that we can cycle pretty comfortably with our children. We're happy to report that actually we're kind of through the other side in terms of the controversy. The business community now has learned to embrace the protected bike lanes. They're now referring to them as the future of the city. They're now wholeheartedly supporting new changes to the streetscape. But it did take pushing through that initial period of controversy. Mayor Robertson was re-elected twice. He just completed his 3rd term as the longest-serving mayor in Vancouver's history. We couldn't be more proud of the end results in terms of what can be accomplished in a fairly short period of time. So the one thing we really want to stress is that our streets are malleable. They can be changed. They're not set in stone. So the last Dutch city we'll talk about this evening is Eindhoven, and it's a little bit further out of the way on the southeastern border with Germany, away from the more populated Randstad region where Amsterdam and Rotterdam are. But it has a really rich industrial past. It was the home of the Philips Electronic Company for almost 100 years, which was started out as a light bulb factory during the First World War, and really drove the city's development for almost a century. It did receive some damage during the Second World War. There was some bombing in the city centre, and that, like as in Rotterdam, that damage was used as an excuse to start building around the automobile. So they again started knocking down buildings, widening streets, creating surface parking lots, and making it easier for people to drive into the city. The key difference between Eindhoven and Rotterdam is they started building space recycling fairly early on, but it was never to allow cyclists or to prioritize cycling. It was always just to get the bikes out of the way. Bikes were deemed a nuisance. They were deemed an antiquated mode of transportation that would eventually die out. But in order to kind of appease the frustrated motorists, they built these separated cycle tracks that were often kind of indirect, down through tunnels, up over bridges that were all designed to kind of get the bikes out of sight and out of mind. And that kind of continued unchecked until the mid-1990s, when Philips announced it was moving its operations overseas. It moved its head offices to Amsterdam and left Eindhoven in a pretty dire economic and existential crisis, because this was the city's major employer and a huge source of its identity and its pride. But rather than kind of sit back and suffer a fate, Eindhoven really used that as an opportunity to reinvent itself, and it was in a large part through cycling and cycling infrastructure projects that it accomplished that. So we had the Hoven Ring, which we saw earlier, which was this spectacular floating suspended bicycle roundabout that really serves as a connection between Eindhoven and a nearby village. So it has certainly a practical purpose as well as a pretty spectacular city branding purpose. There's the Van Gogh Starry Night bike path, which is a homage both to Philips as a light bulb, as Eindhoven used to be known as the City of Light, but also to Vincent van Gogh, who lived and worked in a nearby village in Neuen. And then they more recently started to renovate and retrofit a lot of those tunnels, so those dark, dank, kind of unpleasant spaces where the bicycle routes go under the roads or under the train tracks. They've used a plan called the City of Smiles, where they're creating a lot of fun street art to really try to lighten up these spaces and create a sense of pride. And this particular one was John Cleese in Monty Python, and we actually had John Cleese come out to the opening of the event, so garnered a lot of international headlines, and again reinforcing this idea that Eindhoven wants to attract talent, it wants to attract business, and it wants to attract visitors to their city to come and visit, to cycle, and to spend money. It's also the home of the second largest airport in the Netherlands, but a great number of those people simply hop on the first train to Amsterdam, so this was all part of also a plan to get people to try and stay for a night or two to explore the city by bicycle and hopefully spend some money as well. So for a similar North American city that underwent a similar economic transformation, we like to point out the city of Calgary, Alberta, which is just the other side of the Rocky Mountains from Vancouver. It's right smack in the middle of oil country in the prairies. Its proximity to the tar sands makes it a rather important oil and gas hub. There's a lot of international oil and gas headquarters located there, but when the price of oil dropped about 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of those businesses jumped ship, and the city was in a pretty serious economic crisis. Their vacancy rate hit at 35% in the city center, and they were faced with this kind of devastating blow to their city. But they came up with a plan, again, to attract businesses, to attract talent, to attract residents into the city center, and that was also in large part due to through the active urban transportation through cycling. The first piece of that was the aptly named Peace Bridge, the red colored structure there, designed by Santiago Calatrava. It was the first piece of significant active transportation infrastructure the city had ever built. It was also the first time they specifically mentioned beauty in the design brief. So the attitude up to that point was, we'll go to Paris if we need beauty. Here in Calgary, we just need it to work, which is kind of depressing. But you know, they built it. It was now a huge kind of source of city pride. It's a place on the river where people gather and they don't just pass through. People get their wedding photographs taken there. Is now the center of a lot of marketing campaigns, and it's pretty amazing but important walking and cycling connection to the city center. And once those bicycles started coming over the river into the city, they pointed out the latent demand for protected bike lanes in the city center. And to their credit, the Calgary City Council decided not just to build one protected bike lane, but to build a half a dozen that would all open on the same day, an entire network of protected bike lanes that would virtually be implemented overnight. This would be done on a pilot pilot project basis. So they sold this to the residents of Calgary that we'll try this for 18 months, we'll measure it, we'll adapt it. If you guys use it, if it doesn't have too much of an impact on business, on traffic, then we'll keep it. And if it, for whatever reason, fails, then we can always take it out again, no harm, no foul, and put things back to normal. And sure enough, you know, Calgarians came out on their bikes in droves, even in a frozen prairie Canadian city. It induced 1.8 million new bicycle trips over those 18 months. Little to no impact on automobile traffic. So what was initially approved, the pilot project, 8-7 vote on City Council, was made permanent by 10 votes to 4. So there were a number of councillors and residents who were convinced, simply seeing that the cycle traffic network could work in their city. And for all the plaudits that Vancouver gets for implementing something like this over 10 years, we like to point to Calgary as an example of something that can be done in 18 months. So one thing that the Netherlands has done really well is capturing those short car trips in their cities. We're talking 2 to 3 miles within their city limits, and they've kind of tapped out that market, if you will, that possibility, and now they're starting to look further afield in terms of intercity trips that are longer distances. The Rijnwal pad is a pretty amazing new piece of infrastructure between the twin cities of Arnhem and Nijmegen on the east of the Netherlands. It's 14 kilometers, beautiful 4-meter wide red asphalt, and it's also designed, like the smart routes in Groningen, for cyclists to get from the city centre of Nijmegen to the city centre of Arnhem without having to put their foot down once. The idea being that there's a fair amount of car traffic on the expressway between the two cities, and the train system's basically running at capacity, so they could give commuters a viable alternative that also happens to be quite beautiful, quite pleasant, quite direct, and visible from the motorway. So when you're sitting in traffic, you're glancing over at the people that are cycling freely from A to B. And it's been really successful in terms of drawing people out of their cars and attracting or capturing those longer distance car trips. And that's made especially possible with the rise of electric bikes. The stat that we managed to dig up is the Netherlands is the largest e-bike market per capita in the world. 1 in 3 new bicycles sold in the Netherlands are electric assist, despite the fact that it's flat as a pancake. And it's more because they're using e-bikes to help people maintain their mobility into older age. 80% of those e-bikes are going to people 50 years of age or older. Helping people travel longer distances than they perhaps initially would have, and to make trips that they otherwise deem difficult. So on average, they're only being ridden 2 or 3 kilometers an hour faster than traditional bicycles. It's more the psychological boost and the physical boost that they give people to make trips they wouldn't otherwise take by bike and make them feel like they can make those trips. And then another thing the Dutch really do well, realizing that people cannot possibly commute 10, 15, 20 kilometers, is connecting bicycles with their public transport system. So they have these gigantic bicycle parking facilities, a lot of the train stations, a lot of the bus depots, and they build the infrastructure that feeds into these transportation hubs, which is important. They don't actually allow bikes on the buses and trains, because it's not a scalable solution, it's not an efficient solution. It breaks down as soon as you get 2 or 3 bikes on the public transport system. So they allow for the parking at one end of the public transport trip, and then the last mile solution on the other end. And that's the OE Fiets bike share system. It's the national bike share system that you can rent a bike for. I think it's €3.75 for 24 hours that you can get a bike from a train station, and you use the same tap card, the OV chip card that you would use for the public transport system. It's just basically an ad fare on your transport ride. And as a result, 50% of all train rides in the Netherlands start with a bicycle ride, which is pretty astounding when you think about it. That's 1.2 million train trips that are initiated with a bicycle ride. And that's important not just because it makes their transport system more efficient. As this diagram shows, people are usually willing to walk about 1 or 2 kilometers to get to a transit hub. When you put a bicycle into the mix, suddenly that number is increased by 5 times. You're able to cycle 5 times the distance that you would with the same time and effort as you would otherwise walk. But rather than spacing the stations 5 times further apart, the Dutch actually kind of leave things the same, and that provides options. So if you live in one of these kind of overlapping areas, you suddenly have a choice of 2, 3, 4 different transit routes that you can take, which really makes it time and convenient, competitive with just taking a car from A to B. And then another area where the Dutch are really innovating is around bakfiets, which just translates to box bikes or cargo bikes as we know them here. I think we're perhaps more familiar with them in a North American setting as the family SUV replacement. You can throw a couple of kids in the front or a couple of bags of groceries and get to and from where you need to go pretty easy and conveniently. But there's a lot of businesses in the Netherlands that have started to utilize cargo bikes, specifically electric cargo bikes, as a competitive business edge. The Albert Heijn, which is the largest grocery store chain in the Netherlands, has started using these urban aero cargo bikes to deliver crates of groceries. That particular bike in the top left corner carries 30 crates of groceries, and they now, on a pilot basis, have started delivering them around the streets of Amsterdam. The Coca-Cola company, Utrecht, has started equipping its service technicians with electric cargo bikes. So rather than driving a kind of half-empty van around servicing vending machines, they are out getting exercise and fresh air, and they can fit their toolboxes in the front of the cargo bike and do their service routes that way. And then perhaps most excitedly is the implications for freight and postal services. Not only has the National Postal System started to roll out cargo bikes for their deliveries, but a lot of the heavy hitters in the logistics industry, whether it's FedEx, DHL, or UPS, have started scaling up these solutions for last mile delivery, where they can make far more deliveries than a traditional van because they're not sitting in traffic, they're not rolling around the street for looking for a parking space, and obviously these vehicles cost a lot less in terms of servicing. So it's adding a new level of efficiency, potentially, cost savings, as well as a competitive edge. And we're starting to see now Seattle and Portland and some other cities that are starting to experiment with these types of logistics systems. So that was kind of the qualitative case, if you will, for building cycling cities. Let's just talk a little bit about the quantitative case, because I think there's a lot of facts and figures that actually back up the need for these types of changes, not the least of which is the amount of death and destruction that we kind of assume is the status quo and is unavoidable on our streets. The traffic fatality rate in the Netherlands is currently at about 3.6 deaths per 100,000 residents, and in the United States it's over 10. It's almost triple the rate of fatality in terms of per capita. And then there's studies that show that if the U.S. were to implement similar safe street measures, then they could save the equivalent of 22,000 lives per year, each and every year. But it's important not just to focus on how safe streets preserve human life. We have to talk about how it extends human life. And this was the amazing stat that we stumbled across when we were writing the book, is the fact that the Netherlands is the only country in the European Union that's actually reversing its rate of obesity. It's predicted to be just 8.5%, while in Ireland it will be almost 50%, and I know in Canada it's predicted to be quite close to 50% by 2030 as well. And it's not because they eat well. If you've had pizza bollen or mayo and fries, it's more that they build physical activity in the way they get from A to B, so they don't have to squeeze their gym time in to actually get physical exercise. And then a benefit that really hits home to us as parents is the fact that Dutch children are among the happiest in the world. There was a study that UNICEF did in 2013 that ranked them #1 in terms of Western countries, specifically referencing their ability and their freedom to roam their cities, the the automobile and providing bicycling as a viable mode of transportation for all ages has on enabling their kids to get out from under their parents' wing means that they enjoy a better quality of life and ultimately much more happy. And I would argue the parents are probably just as happy not having to shuttle them around to practice in school and the like. But what about the drivers, you might ask? I think this may be the most compelling argument, is the fact that it's not a zero-sum game. By building space for cycling, the Dutch have actually inadvertently also created space for driving. Every time you enable someone to walk, cycle, or take public transport, you're freeing up precious road space for people who want to drive and people who need to drive. And that's underlined by the fact that Waze, the traffic navigation app, has ranked the Netherlands as the most pleasant place in the world to drive a car for the past 3 years in a row. And we would argue that's, again, a product of making the car the last resort for a lot of Dutch families. And so it can be a win-win situation when you're reallocating space for cycling. Drivers can benefit as well. So that brings us full circle back to the beginning of the talk. You know, I think when we find ourselves in rooms like this, full of like-minded people, we assume that everyone understands these benefits. When I've been to conferences where the tech and the tech industry, the politicians are out there saying we're going to have self-driving cars and flying cars and autonomous cars and electric cars, and no one's actually talking about having fewer cars. So we really need to up our game in terms of communicating the benefits of building a cycling city and the fact that we do have this alternate vision for places where we can live, work, and play. So that's, how are we doing for time? 40 minutes, well done. So this is the point of the presentation where I point you to the bookseller at the front of the room. If you enjoyed that, that was kind of the Coles notes of the book. But just want to leave you with this thought that yes, the Dutch have accomplished a lot. Yes, they're 50 years ahead of us, perhaps. But they made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn. And there's no reason we cannot follow in their footsteps, perhaps even moving at an accelerated pace, knowing what we do from their mistakes and their past transgressions. So the quote that we like to leave people with is, it's an adapted Chinese proverb, and it simply says that the best time to build a cycle track is 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. Thank you for your attention, and